Welcome back to another episode of your hope-filled perspective, where it's always our goal to restore hope, renew minds, and empower listeners to live in their God-given identity. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Bengtson, and I'm excited that you've joined us in this Sacred Scars Stories series. That's a mouthful. But sometimes our wounds feel like they're overwhelming, just like the title of this series. What we want to share through this series is that we all go through pain. Some of us it's physical, for others it's emotional, for others it's relational or even spiritual. Sometimes it's grief or loss, and sometimes we even experience secondary pain, the pain that's inflicted by the words or actions of others when we're already dealing with a painful event. But through this series, we're sharing stories of those who have gone through devastating circumstances. They've been wounded right to their core, but now they are on the other side of healing and they have a beautiful scar to show for that experience. To sum up today's episode, I just want to remind you of 2 Corinthians 1:4. He comforts us in all our trouble so that we can comfort others. When they are troubled, we will be able to give them the same comfort that God gave us. And my guest today is doing exactly that. You know her because she's been a guest on the podcast before. It's Lisa Saruga, who's a licensed professional counselor. She's a keynote speaker, an author, and a legal and ethical specialist. And she specializes in therapy for victims of sexual violence. Her own story resulting in the opening of a 35-year-old cold case when someone reported the identity of her assailant. That man, though, was never arrested, and she's had to deal with the wounds from that event. She's going to share a little bit of that story with you today and the resulting sacred scar. Welcome back.
Hi, it's so good to be with you.
You shared your story in my book, Sacred Scars, but not everybody has had a chance to read that. And I really wanted to have you on the podcast because if my listeners have been listening for any length of time, they'll know that one of the things that I say so often is that frequently some of our greatest areas of ministry come out of our greatest woundings. So will you share about that significant event that happened to wound you?
I will. I'm so grateful that you included my story in your book, because I'm grateful for the scar at this point. That doesn't mean that didn't happen fast. Um, so when I was 18 years old, I was sleeping in my residence hall. My roommate was gone for the weekend, so I was by myself. And I woke up in the middle of the night and there was a man in a ski mask crouched next to my bed. And it was a very violent time. I was knifed, I was nearly suffocated, and I was sexually assaulted. But I never saw his face, and case was closed pretty quickly. Uh, I just kind of set it aside, never processed, didn't really go to counseling. I just kind of packed it away in the back of my mind and never even told my adult children what had happened. So 35 years later, 2018, I got a call from the police at the university, and somebody had just called them and reported the identity of the guy in the mask. So my cold case was reopened, which it always surprises me how many people said, wow, that's great. You must be so excited. And it wasn't exciting at all because I had never processed the wound. There was no healing that had occurred. So all of a sudden, that open wound was wide open. And I experienced PTSD. I have been a trauma therapist for a long time, but that in that moment, I finally knew what PTSD felt like.
And that happens frequently,
Mhm.
where something happens, we're embarrassed or we're afraid, or we live in fear and regret and remorse, and we just want to pack it away.
Yeah.
We think if we don't talk about it, it won't hurt us.
Well, I think something that I've noticed as a trauma therapist is that a lot of people post-trauma minimize what they've gone through. And I think it's self-preservation. It's just easier to pretend like it was not a big deal. No one else is talking about it, so it must not be a big deal. And, generally people don't talk a lot about it to the victim because they don't want to harm the victim. But then the victim starts thinking nobody even remembers.
When you look back on that and how you chose to deal with that experience,
Mhm.
would you say that that held you back in any way? Or the experience of shame or fear, or did it limit you in walking in any kind of freedom?
I think it definitely limited me. I mean, it changed, well, it changed the trajectory of my career. I was going to be a music teacher. And a year after this happened, I switched to political science because I wanted to go to law school so I could put guys in ski masks behind bars. Um, and when I got in with a law firm and saw that nobody was going to jail, then I thought, well, then we're going to need counselors. So I became a counselor. So it definitely changed my life in many ways. I think it really impacted my parenting because of the fear that something could happen to my kids. I was probably more cautious than a lot of moms would be. I would have said prior to the reopening of the case, I would have said, nope, I packed it away and it didn't impact me at all. Once it was reopened and I walked through the process of counseling, real counseling for this issue, I can look back and say it definitely did impact me.
Without even realizing it, do you think it impacted your marriage?
Absolutely. I am married now and it's not my first husband. When something like that happens, it really inhibits all things physical. You
Mhm.
know, all romantic physical touch becomes weird. Um, so yeah, I think it did. I think it did harm my marriage.
I would think something like that, that's so significant, being so violated,
Mhm.
you almost couldn't expect it not to inhibit trust of other people,
Right.
whether it's a spouse or even friends or family, because
Yeah.
who's safe anymore?
Yeah. And in my case, this wasn't somebody that I knew. It was a stranger in a ski mask, which is unusual. A lot of times when people are sexually assaulted, it's somebody that they know, sometimes even somebody that they love. And I think that would have harmed trust far more than a stranger. Now, I don't like to be alone at night. I don't like to walk alone. I don't like to travel alone very much. There's some of that. The trust, I think, impacted that more than within relationships because I didn't have a relationship with that man.
Right.
Yeah.
Did it impact your ability to trust God?
Oh, yes, it did. Um, and ironically, it also led to my deeper faith in
Mm.
God. I was I was raised in a church, but I hadn't yet made that faith my own. And when this crime occurred, I actually prayed out loud and I was praying for him and for me, so in that way I did know there's a God and I need to turn to him right now. And then following that experience, I think I didn't fully connect with God right away. I had this impression that God was an angry God, with lightning bolts.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of afraid of him. I was glad to know that I could, yell his name out when I was in distress. But it took me a while to really figure out the relationship with God too. And I do think trust was broken because, there so many times I talk to clients who just don't even believe in God anymore after something traumatic happens because they think God let them down. And God is a God of justice and he is a God who loves us unconditionally, but he also gave us free will, including the guy in the ski mask. He gave him free will too. And he said, in this life, you're going to have trouble, but take heart, I've overcome the world. And I think it took me many years, many years before I could understand that God didn't purpose for me to experience that trauma. But it took even more years for me to realize he can use it for his purposes if I let him.
And that's something that I talk about in Sacred Scars, is that we have to be willing to surrender that wound. God's not going to
Mhm.
arm wrestle us for it, but
Yeah.
he's there and waiting, and he wants us to bring it to him.
And there's the interesting part of my story, relating to what you just said, is about 2 weeks before I got the call from the police. This is 35 years later. I had written down all the details of what had happened and I put it in my nightstand. And if I got a new nightstand, I put it back in the new nightstand. So I've been sleeping next to these words for 35 years. And about 2 weeks before, I had this, I don't know, revelation that I just decided I'm going to get rid of all negative things in my life. So I got rid of divorce papers. I was just cleaning stuff out. And I thought about that being in the drawer, and I pulled it out and I said out loud, God, I'm done with this. It's yours now. And I tore it up and threw it away. And 2 weeks later, my life changed completely. 2 weeks later, he was identified. God did wait for me to give that back to him, literally.
Literally.
Yeah.
Can you share how has God healed the wound and formed a sacred scar and even, dare I say, use this horrible circumstance for good?
I'm still amazed by what God has done, because when that case reopened, one of the things that he revealed is I never got the help I needed 35 years before. And so I found a godly psychologist that I worked with, and did some really difficult counseling to really address what had happened in the past. And it wasn't long, I'm talking days after this whole thing was revealed, I started getting calls from legislators, from people involved in the Larry Nassar case. And every person that called said, you really need to write a book. And I had always said, I'm never writing a book.
Be
I
careful
have
what you
done,
tell God never about.
yes, I have done more than enough college work to have a PhD, but I never wanted to write the dissertation. So, so I decided to be obedient to God because it had come up so many times. And I sat down, I wrote a book. I didn't know a first thing about writing a book. And then after I wrote it, I went to my first writing conference. Um, and interesting, God opened these doors I never could have predicted. When I went to that first conference, it was Speak Up in Grand Rapids, and they used my book proposal as the sample. So my story was told to 400 authors in the room. By the end of the day, I had an agent. It's just amazing to me how he's opened doors. These legislators that were calling, I thought, my story, what happened to me really reveals a lot of loopholes and gaps in our laws that lead to the fact that only 2.5% of rapists go to jail. And I started researching, and I found there are some things in our laws that could change and make it more possible to prosecute rapists. And so I just started calling legislators and making appointments and going to their offices and talking with them. And that blossomed into so much more. I have now written bills for the state of Michigan that are not active right now because we're changing some things, but they have been active for years. I connected with some people in Washington, D.C. Again, God's story. He opened doors on the 35th anniversary of what had happened. I decided I'm not going to sit home and sulk. I'm going to start making some phone calls. And I started calling some legislators, and they said, there's a legislator from Washington, D.C. doing a debate in your hometown in a half an hour. And I got up and I went to the debate. And the very first question was about sexual violence, which was unusual. That's not usually the first question. And I started writing a letter, and I wrote to this legislator, and I thought, if I can catch him afterwards, maybe I can hand him this letter. So as I was leaving, the legislator looked at me and said, and waved and said, it's so good to see you. I haven't seen, it's so good to see a friendly face. And he put off this line of people that were going to talk to him to talk just to me. I didn't know him. I don't know why he thought he knew me, but I said, I just have this letter, if you're willing to read it. And he said, I will. And the next morning he called me and invited me to Washington, D.C. to meet with some other legislators. And that has grown until just this past week. I was in Washington, D.C., and I got to present to several members of the House of Representatives and shared my research, shared my ideas, and they were very interested. I'll be going back again. And slowly I can see wheels turning where maybe difference can be made, a huge difference. And God did things like I was on the metro, which is like the subway in Washington, D.C. And I asked the guy behind me something about the next stop. And we talked for 5 minutes. And he turned out to be the CIA agent that was the whistleblower in the waterboarding incidents. And he said, when we were talking, I'm writing a book. And I said, I am too. And he said, well, let's trade cards. We did. And that night he called and said, I have a friend who's interested in your story. And his friend was Brian Ross, who was the creator of Dateline. He was on 2020. I mean, he investigative reporter, very famous. And he has been filming a documentary for 3 years that's going to release later this year on my story that could open even more doors to make a difference with legislation. So you just never know what God's got planned. But the minute I said, okay, God, this is yours. And once the case reopened, I said, I'm willing to do whatever purpose you have in mind for this. If you open doors, I'll step through. Doors have just opened and opened and opened. I'm just amazed at what he's done.
I'm so proud of you
Thank you.
because the two things that it required was first surrender.
Mhm.
You just said, God, whatever. I'm tired of doing it my way. And the
Mhm.
second thing that it required was your willing obedience. You didn't go kicking and screaming. He opened doors for you to go to
Mhm.
DC. And there may have been some fear and trepidation. I don't know, but you went.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting is I would think there would be fear and trepidation. I have never felt nervous when I've gone in front of legislators. I I feel like God is feeding me the answers when they ask questions. I have confronted legislators when they've had, you know, wrong ideas about sexual assault. And I feel like I've been able to do it professionally and kindly, but it's only by God. It's only through God that that could happen.
Well, and I suspect the reason that you don't have fear and trepidation is because you are going in obedience, and scripture says, open your mouth and he will fill it. And he's doing
Exactly.
that.
I
And when you
really
put
feel,
your fingers on the keyboard, he's writing your story through you.
yeah. And my first book is coming out in February.
And
Even
where
publishing is happening.
it is happening, and I had the honor of endorsing it. So
Yes.
your story is a powerful one. But listeners, if you're listening and you're thinking, well, I can't do that, I can't write a book, or I can't present legislation, or God's not going to call you to do the same thing that he's called Lisa to do. He
Mhm.
didn't call me to do the same thing that Lisa has done. But the point of sharing these stories is hopefully to help you see that so often the things we go through, we think are so devastating, so embarrassing, so shameful. We think that they disqualify us from the abundant life that God offers or disqualify us from ministry. And very often it is going through those things and willingly surrender to God. And he
Mhm.
brings something beautiful out of it. For you, it might be having coffee with your neighbor and saying, you don't know this about me, but I've gone through that too. Let me
Yeah.
share what I've learned, or let me be a source of support. Let me be a sounding board. But when you are willing to offer it up to God and say, I can't do it on my own, I need
Mhm.
you to heal it and bring good from it. I
Yeah.
promise you, you will. It just doesn't always look the way that we think it will. And it doesn't always unfold in the timeline that we
Mhm.
want it to unfold. But you can be assured that God's plan for you is good, and you can trust his goodness and his faithfulness.
Mhm. And I love that whatever he calls you to, he will equip you for. You
Yeah.
know, I was studying music when this happened. I ended up getting a degree in political science. I ended up becoming a counselor. I work with victims now of sexual violence. And I love that you started with that quote from Second Corinthians, you know, because I really feel that God has equipped me to comfort others with the comfort that I received from him. He also equipped me with a knowledge of politics and how to talk to legislators. My family used to laugh at me because I had so many different degrees and they seemed unrelated, but God was planning to use every one of them.
And that's how our amazing God works.
Yep.
Thank you for sharing about your sacred scar. And friends, I hope that you'll pick up a copy of Sacred Scars and read the full account of Lisa's stories, as well as so many others who were brave enough to share their sacred scar story. Lisa, will you tell our listeners where they can find out more about you or your ministry or this book that's coming out?
Yes, my website is lisasaruga.com. I don't know should I say the spelling?
We'll put it in the
So,
show notes.
all right. Yeah, that would be the best place to start. And if you follow me, if you email, subscribe, you'll get some journaling tips that are helpful for everybody. So
Friend, I just so appreciate you. I appreciate what you're doing to help other people, and I appreciate you coming back on the podcast.
thank you so much.
Listeners, if there was something from today's episode that encouraged your heart, or maybe you know someone going through a really difficult time and they're having a hard time imagining that God could bring anything good, would you consider sharing this episode with them to encourage their heart? And would you consider picking up a copy of Sacred Scars and gifting it to someone who wonders, can God really bring good out of my wounded heart? Because the answer is yes. Until we meet again next week, this has been your hope-filled perspective, and it's my prayer for you that you have a hope-filled week.